This week on The Wheelhouse. Taxes. And a little later, car taxes. For Connecticut Public, I'm Frankie Graziano. This is The Wheelhouse. It's a show that connects politics to the people. We got your weekly dose of politics in Connecticut and beyond, right here. A tax cut for the ages. Connecticut will soon see what's being called the largest reduction in income tax since it was first enacted in 1991. And as Connecticut cut taxes, federal lawmakers huddle over a proposed $200-something billion reduction. Today's Wheelhouse is dedicated to tax cuts and what they mean for you and me. But first, the President of the United States spent this past Friday in Connecticut. He went to the first ever Safer Community Summit. That's an event organized by U.S. Senator from Connecticut, Chris Murphy, and Murphy's staff. Murphy and Senator Richard Blumenthal led this effort last year to break through a 30-year deadlock on federal gun safety legislation. This summit marked 1 year since that bipartisan Safer Communities Act was signed into law. Molly Ingram was at the summit. She's a Fairfield County reporter at WSHU. She joins us now. Welcome to the Wheelhouse, Molly.
Thanks for having me. Happy to be here.
Thank you so much for coming on, Molly. I want to talk to you about the crowd at the summit at the University of Hartford. They got to hear President Biden speak. What was his message about gun reform?
Yeah, so he definitely used the event to celebrate how much he was able to pass last year in terms of gun control. The summit, as you said, was planned to coincide with the anniversary of the Safer Communities Act signing. He was definitely still riding that high, and he probably will through this election cycle. But he was also clear that he wants to do more, which is unlikely to happen unless he gets reelected and the Democrats keep the Senate and flip the House. But he praised Connecticut extensively for what they were able to do this legislative session, and he wants the country to adopt those laws too. He spent a lot of time praising legislators and advocates as well. Of course, the Sandy Hook shooting was a huge turning point in the conversation about stricter gun control. A lot of people got involved in that conversation after 2012, including, as you said, Chris Murphy, who's been a huge part of the national gun reform conversation.
Did you say he was on a high? Do you think the crowd was on a high as well? What was the energy like there?
Oh, absolutely. People were amped up for sure. Biden especially received standing ovation, but all of the speakers did. I don't think the president spoke 2 sentences without a round of applause. Everyone was very reactive to each speaker. And I think it was because they all had their own stories about gun violence, and the speeches really resonated with that.
A lot of energy inside, according to Molly, as you just heard. Outside, small crowd of gun rights supporters gathered, maybe 10 to 15 deep, something like that. I heard that from Eddie Martinez, who is my co-worker. He covers Fairfield County breaking news. Head on over to ctpublic.org for his coverage of that small protest. Molly Ingram's here. She's from WSHU. You can go to wshu.org to see her coverage of the event. Hartford, not the only stop for the president the other day. Made it to maybe another sort of capital here in Connecticut, the money capital of Connecticut, Greenwich. Why'd the president go there, would you say, Molly? Why'd he go there?
Yeah, so he flew to Westchester and then drove to Greenwich for a fundraiser hosted by a hedge fund founder. There were less than 50 people there, and each seat cost $25,000, which is definitely steep, even for an upper-class American. But it's not unusual for those kinds of events, especially when he hasn't really been campaigning for his second term for that long. He needs to make a lot of money and fast. Lamont, Blumenthal, Murphy, and Himes were all there. Which is not surprising that Lamont and Murphy were there. They're on his campaign's National Advisory Board, which is about 100 elected officials that are supposed to help him get reelected. He talked at the event about green energy, the importance of bipartisan governing. He seems adamant that he'll be able to reach across the aisle into 2024.
$25,000. Wow. I don't know if they're reaching in the couches over there in Greenwich to try to get that cash. I got to let you go, Molly, but before I do, God save the Queen, man. Everyone's talking about that. What is that?
Nobody in the press section knew what he was talking about. I heard a few different explanations. One of his staffers said he was speaking to a woman in the audience, but I don't really understand why he would say that to her either. So we don't know.
Oh, interesting end to the trip. It was a momentous trip for Joe Biden, but interesting end to the trip. Molly Ingram, you've done a great job covering this. Thank you so much for calling into the Wheelhouse this morning.
Thank you for having me.
You take care, Molly. And now I got two guests to join me because we're going to pivot to that tax talk that I was promising. Sue Haig is on the phone, state capitol and political writer at the Associated Press. Susan, thank you so much for joining us this morning.
Good morning. Thanks for having me.
Thank you for coming on. And you're joined, he's in studio, Ken Dixon, government and politics reporter, CT Insider, CT Post, New Haven Register, Hearst. Which one should we say? You from CT Insider?
I think you covered all the bases there.
Okay, good. Ken Dixon's joining us. You can join in the conversation if you want to talk to Susan, Ken, and myself. 888-720-9677. 888-720-9677. Susan, we keep hearing about the historic nature of this tax cut. Can you kind of help us with what makes this so special?
Well, it's really the largest change to the personal income tax in almost 30 years. It will reduce the different tiers of the income tax. So, not to get into the weeds, but it should affect about 1 million tax filers, which is really about 60% of all filers. And it changes the different tiers. And in addition to the income tax, there's also an increase in the earned income tax credit, and that benefits like another 211,000 filers. So a lot of people are impacted by this.
Ken, can you drill a little bit deeper into that, into those tiers? So she was talking about reducing different tiers. So what are we talking about? We're talking about individuals, filers getting a break. What's the cap there? We're talking about married couples as well. Give me some numbers here.
Well,
what do you got?
We're not talking about like crying kind of tears. Yeah, it's
TIER.
It's generally reducing the 5% down to 4.5%. First year, according to analysis I read yesterday, it's like the 190 million would be saved for taxpayers in the income tax in the first year and 421 in the second year. So it's definitely substantial.
As Susan mentioned, increasing the income tax credit for low-income workers, that current rate 30.5%. It's going to go to the federal rate of 40%. Expansion of existing exemptions on certain pension and annuity earnings to benefit seniors as well. While you're listening, folks, feel free to toss us some tax questions. You can join the conversation, 888-720-9677. Don't give us your tax bill or anything like that, or any of those kind of tax questions, just about whatever this proposal was for the governor's office that made it through. As Susan mentioned, 1 million people will benefit from this plan. Here's what Governor Ned Lamont had to say about the tax cuts when he signed them into law.
I think it makes a difference in this inflationary environment. It sends a signal, especially to working families in the middle class. This is a state that's on the mend, getting our fiscal house in order, and you're going to share the benefits of it.
I need you both to react to that if you can. Sue, go ahead. We're talking, I guess, about Connecticut's financial position.
Well, I've been covering the legislature for a while, and for years and years and years, we were always talking about deficits, and there was always talk about cutting programs, laying off state employees, and now we have these huge surpluses. So things have really changed in the last, I guess, 4 or 5 years or so. It's just things have sort of turned around, and a lot of people say that they credit these things called fiscal guardrails that puts caps on, spending and making sure that money goes into the rainy day fund and paying down debt. And it has made a big difference. And on top of that, there's been a lot of programs have been able to benefit from federal COVID funds. And this is something that, and I can talk about this later, but we're not alone in this too. I mean, there's been a ton of money that legislatures have to spend on tax cuts around the country.
Well, it's only a few $100s per taxpayer, so don't get too excited about it. You know,
Pouring the water on us.
well,
Huh?
well, I mean,
Yeah.
what's a pair of sneakers
He's a
go
downer.
for?
Pair of sneakers, about $150
Okay, well, there you go.
for even like your good Nikes. These right here are $120.
Okay, well, you can get a couple of pairs of those maybe. It's throwing people a bone. I think, given my druthers as a taxpayer, I'd say don't write me the check. Just put it into the pensions. You know, the underfunded pensions. Really.
That's the kind of conversation I was having you guys in the background before you came on the air in the last couple of days, because while they're flush with cash now and you're going to make this decision to cut taxes, the long term, there is something like $80 billion of unfunded obligations, something like that, guys?
Yeah, no, that's a good ballpark number.
So if we do keep the fiscal guardrails in order, do we still look like we can tackle that $80 billion deficit?
Well, as long as you keep getting the sales tax and the robust income taxes. You know, a lot of New Yorkers came over here during the Rona. But they bought up all the houses, so there's no housing stock left, and they're making the financial picture look a lot better. Oh, yeah, and the ARPA funding too.
Sue, I want to go back to you on this because you said you were going to talk about this. This is a key thing. We're talking about folks being flush with cash since, as Ken deems it, the Rona. People are getting flush with cash from all those federal dollars from coronavirus relief. So are more states, not just Connecticut, are more states starting to lean into tax cuts?
Yeah, I mean, it was a huge thing definitely in 2022. You know, personal income taxes were performing significantly higher in most states, and general sales tax collections are up. And so I think they were about, according to the NCSL, there were about 13 states that reduced personal income tax and corporate taxes in 2021. Another 14 did it in 2022. And this year, it's still on track for more states to be cutting income taxes and other taxes. Right now, there's at least, this was as of mid-May, at least 13 states have now approved significant tax cutting changes. And that includes a bunch of things like the income tax rates, sales tax, rebates, targeted business taxes. So we're really not alone in this. And I've seen it in a lot of red states, but also some blue states as well. And a lot of them are doing a lot of the same things that we're looking at here in Connecticut.
I want to get to the concern over the tax cuts. I'm sure there has been some concern expressed about the tax cuts. Just 13 lawmakers out of 187 that voted for the budget in both chambers voted against it. Just 13 out of 187. But I'm sure there's still concern, Ken.
Well, I mean, you've got the social service providers who would like to raise taxes on the millionaires. I mean, they were staging daily protests out there. You were out there during those waning weeks of the General Assembly.
And then, Susan, too, Republicans, they wanted more of a tax cut.
Right. I think the argument that they were making was, taxpayers need this relief now. They're dealing with inflation. They were pitching sales tax changes, gas tax, permanent gas tax changes, things like that. That in the end, it ended up being everybody did get at least something, and that was the personal income tax changes and the earned EITC, the earned income tax credit, and there's some other things in there like some retirement changes, and it ends up being about $460 million. So it's as Ken said, the average person, it's maybe a couple of hundred or so, but from the budget standpoint, that's a lot of money, $460 million.
So let's finish off this segment by asking you guys one question. We're going to open it up to both of you guys. Do we know how Connecticut residents are feeling about this? I'm going to look to Ken first because I'm looking at him while I ask this question.
I don't even think people are noticing. The proof will be in the pudding. It's going to show up in withholding, right, Sue?
Yeah, I would think so. But just this is a non-scientific poll, but people I've talked to, I'm actually surprised that people have heard about it, and they do know that some tax changes are on the way, and think that maybe this is the start of something that could maybe bigger tax changes down the road. But that's like a totally unscientific poll of a handful of people I've talked to about this.
What could some of those tax changes be down the road? What would we be looking at?
Well, from the progressive side of things, I'm sure there's going to be a renewed push to try to make a permanent child tax credit. That might be something that will probably be decided maybe down the road or debated. Colorado just did it. They increased the earned income tax credit like we did, but they also increased their child tax credit. And often we kind of follow what some of these other blue states do.
Well, Matt Ritter, the Speaker of the House, would be pushing for that next year, right, Sue?
Right. He's expressed interest in it.
We're talking about a permanent child tax credit at the local level, and I have a feeling we'll be talking about that later on in the C segment. Coming up after a quick break, we'll talk about a plan to ditch car taxes in Connecticut. But before we do that, we're going to say goodbye to Susan Haig, state capitol and political writer at the Associated Press. Thank you for coming on, Susan. I hope you had a good time on the new Wheelhouse here.
Yes, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Thank you for coming on, Sue.
Bye, Sue.
Ken,
Bye,
you
Ken.
can stay with us. Ken Dixon of CT Insider. And all of you listening, feel free to join the conversation. 888-720-9677. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. My birthday's coming up, guys. And every year now, I get a nice big gift from the town I live in. A car tax bill. Yeah, if you live in Connecticut, you know that bill's coming July 1st. But because of a bill passed by the Connecticut General Assembly this year, state residents may not get a car tax bill in the future. Ken Dixon stayed with us after that last segment. He's going to talk to us about this car tax bill.
Hush my mouth.
CT Insiders, Ken Dixon. And if you want to join in the conversation, you can call us 888-720-9677. I want to be clear, Ken. Lawmakers didn't actually repeal car taxes this session, right?
Yeah, that's putting it mildly. Everything's incremental there, like little baby steps.
So there was no political will to repeal the car tax, I guess.
That's putting it mildly. I mean, you have to look at it. You should look at it holistically. But that's $1 billion for local government. For schools, and we don't have county government, and Connecticut's big problem is there are 169 towns and cities that do their own thing. They're depending on strong support from the state government, and
But we talked about the political will angle of it, though, right? So when they have no political will, what does that generally mean in Connecticut?
That means they vote to make it a study.
So do you know anything about the study, or I guess it's the task force?
Yeah, study task force. There's shelves in the legislative library full of reports that have never been read after they're given to the General Assembly, if they're given to the General Assembly.
Ken Dixon plays for a band during the weekends called the Bad Slugs. We have to promote them because we got to make sure that they have a full show at Notch 8 if you're listening to this on the first run in Bethel. And I imagine that you guys are going to play there. You guys will play like 45 songs, something like that, maybe.
It's only a 3-hour set, so it's closer to 30-something.
My God, what a busy weekend that is. 30 songs, and you'll see Ken in the band. I wonder if the task force is going to be standing next to you guys enjoying themselves. Maybe they'll be slugging a non-alcoholic beverage or something like that.
We'll be paying sales taxes on our pizzas, I'm sure.
6.99%.
Oh, geez. All right.
Is that, or is it 6.35? I forget. I don't know. What's our sales tax nowadays?
6.35.
6.35. That's right. It went down from 6.99 to 6.35.
That's right. The governor could have done that. The governor could have cut that by 1%.
So, so we're going to get our task force coming up. Before we go any further, I want to tell a quick story. This proposal sponsored, and Ken covered this back in May 15th, something like that. This proposal sponsored by a freshman state senator out of Glastonbury, M.D. Rahman, car tax repeal push. For him, it's 25 years in the making, starting from when he immigrated from the United States from Bangladesh. Back then, he got around via public transit, but eventually Rahman got tired of waiting for the bus, so he saved up money to buy a car. And we're going to play a clip for you right now.
What I learned, oh my goodness, I have to pay the insurance on top of the car tax. Now, I'm the over budget. Can I have enough money to pay the, so I came back, I didn't buy the car.
He didn't buy the car. He was over budget because of the car taxes, and he says he's worried nowadays about people working minimum wage jobs and having to come up with that car tax money. Ken, what are people paying in car taxes nowadays? You got some of those mill rates for me?
Well, on your Lamborghini down in Greenwich, you're paying $11.59 on every $1,000 of value. So, add a couple decimals, $1,100 for the Lamborghini. That's not bad. Bridgeport is these towns in the 40 mil rate are making some amount of money from about $150 million that the legislature enacted a couple of years ago to put a ceiling on it. I think it's 72 towns or something like that. I mean, Hartford's mill rate is 74.
32.9, I think that was capped at, right? The mill rate?
That sounds right to me. I didn't write it down here.
But what you're hinting at when you're talking about that Lambo, it's still going to be expensive because it's a Lamborghini, but at 14 mils? There's a disparity, right?
Yeah, it's under 12, and Bridgeport's paying 3 times that, 3.5 times that. Yeah, and Hartford's crazy. Well, and that's why you find these cities where people don't bother registering their cars or getting insurance, and that's why insurance rates are high, and it's a vicious circle that way.
Costs so much money to live, and then you're talking about Rahman saying the average car tax for a Connecticut resident nowadays $300 to $500.
Yeah, that sounds right. There's one way to spend your income tax savings, right, toward your car tax. Forget the sneakers.
The $200 go back to the car tax. So you saved maybe $300, something like that. You can't buy. Maybe you don't buy the sneakers. Maybe you just pay for your car tax.
Right, that bill's coming, Frankie.
We talked in the first segment about this personal income tax cut. This car tax repeal proposal sort of falls into the personal property tax cut discussion. Who's having this conversation? Why is it an important one? So you have personal property tax. Is that what we're looking at? We need to maybe cut those back more?
I guess if you keep getting the surpluses, you should share it with taxpayers. Certainly next year will be a legislative election year, so people can possibly show that they're doing their jobs in Hartford for their $40,000 full-time job. I really think that the bigger discussion is taxes generally, and then you get into the home rule stuff, and then it's like a death spiral into home rule and housing, and it's really a holistic issue.
So the only thing to pull you out of the death spiral is the task force. Republicans I talked to at the state capitol are skeptical the car tax will be repealed. Tammy Nuccio, she's a Republican state representative out of Towland. She's on the Appropriations Committee where she was involved in negotiations on the new 2-year budget. Here's what Nuccio told me about the new car tax study.
The state's going to have to be providing more money to the towns because the car tax is a really big portion of the town taxes, which funds the Board of Eds. It's a vicious circle. The snake's always eating its tail here. So if they're going to get rid of the car tax, then the state has to supplement that.
The snake's always eating its tail here, Ken. How are they going to supplement it? They're going to look to supplement it?
Well, that's the problem, and you've got a suburban-dominated legislature. I mean, Tammy's a financial analyst. She's right, and you have to get a constitutional amendment to bring back county government. That's not going to happen. the carrot, not the stick approach is a good way to do it. There's some incremental pieces of that. If you start building more affordable housing, you get a bigger tax base, and that's one way to supplement your local budget. But I don't see any of this stuff changing. I mean, I'm pretty interested in seeing what the task force comes up with, but
that's what MD Rahman was saying too. It's up to the task force here. They'll come up with it. We'll see.
Yeah. Well, the money's got to come from somewhere.
$1 billion is what you're talking about trying to replace for these municipalities.
Yeah.
From Connecticut Public Radio, this is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. What time are you guys playing at Notch 8 this week on the first run here?
Oh, we're 8 to 11, man. Thanks a lot.
8 to 11. You got to listen to Ken Dixon play.
I'm regretting I even told you anything about this.
That's okay. We got to get some interest in bad slugs, because you guys had a lot of people at your last show. Ken Dixon, CT Insider's government and politics reporter. Thanks for joining us in studio today for this week's Wheelhouse.
Thanks, Frank.
More tax talk ahead. Join the conversation. 888-720-9677. This is the Wheelhouse from Connecticut Public Radio. I'm Frankie Graziano. We spent most of today's show analyzing the local tax and spending plans. Now we're going national, where House Republicans are making a lot of noise. First, they battled Democrats in debt ceiling negotiations, and now they're calling for a federal tax cut. For some national tax policy analysis, we're joined by Gene Ross, Senior Fellow, Economic Policy, the Center for American Progress. Good morning, Gene.
Good morning, Frankie.
Thank you for joining us, Gene. I appreciate you staying on the line to listen to the conversation. Gene works for the Center for American Progress, which works to improve the lives of all Americans through bold, progressive ideas. You can join the conversation if you want to join us as well. 888-720-9677. As I mentioned, you've been patiently waiting on Zoom while I was talking to Ken and Susan about local taxes. What did you think about what they were talking about happening here in Connecticut with the tax cuts?
I think when you look at what just happened in Connecticut, the tax cut that was signed into law, in many ways, it's a big contrast to what we're seeing going on in Washington right now. You know, as was said earlier, it looks to be a well-targeted proposal. Always like to see states, when they have the resources to do so, increasing earned income tax credits, which are a special type of tax credit that actually puts money back in the pockets of lower to middle income working families. A great thing. The sort of fiscal conservative in me, if I can say that, actually often worries when I see states cut taxes during good times, because we know that, right now the economy is so strong. We've seen jobs come back quite strongly in Connecticut, across the country. But at some point in the future, we know that the economy won't be doing quite as well. And a lot of states do get themselves into trouble by enacting big tax cuts in the good years and then not being able to pay their bills when the economy turns soft.
Let's go national now, Gene. One tax cut plan floating at the federal level comes from House Republicans. What does that entail?
That proposal, there's actually a set of proposals, but the core of it, and I think the part that they are really most invested in, would be reversing a set of 3 business provisions that were actually enacted back as part of the Trump tax package in 2017. And they're what in Washington speak we call pay-fors. They actually raised money that offset some of the big corporate tax rate reduction that was part of that 2017 bill. And that corporate rate reduction was actually enacted immediately back in 2018, but they backloaded these 3 provisions that would raise revenue. It allowed businesses to write off some R&D expenses immediately, allowed them to what's called expense rather than depreciate different property purchases. And it imposed some limits on how much interest businesses could deduct. And those provisions had the delayed effective date. They're now just coming into law. And the Republican bill would actually say, oh, wait a minute, we don't really want to raise those revenues that went to help pay for that huge tax cut enacted back in 2017.
Do you have questions about federal tax policy or federal tax cuts as well? You could join the conversation, 888-720-9677, 888-720-9677. I want to get at the criticism of the plan, because what you really hit at is potential extension of provisions in the Trump tax cut plan. We have the leading Democrat on the House Ways and Means Committee and the director of the National Economic Council of the United States calling out Republicans for preaching austerity one minute and then pivoting to expensive tax cuts the next. This plan kind of increases national debt, doesn't it?
It does. And I mean, the ink, as you said, was barely dry on the debt limit agreement, which will have a big impact on spending over the next several years. It will cap the amount of spending that we've seen, clawed back some dollars that would have gone for tax administration. Some of the monies that went out as part of the pandemic relief plan. So yes, I mean, on the one hand, we heard a lot about we need to tighten our belts, but as soon as the president signed that bill into law, we saw this really pretty substantial tax cut move through the House Ways and Means Committee on a party line vote.
Richard Neal, pretty tough on that tax plan from the Republicans, calling it retroactive corporate tax cuts would be ushered in, next to nothing for the most vulnerable children and families, and sneaking in big favors for big oil. So I guess the big Democrat concern there is that once you have these provisions of the 2017 tax law expire, there could be even bigger cuts in 2025. Let's move now to the Democrat plan. What do you got for you just wrote a story on this at the Center for American Progress. This is hot off the press. I believe it came out on Tuesday. What's the plan by Joe Biden here in the White House?
I think we have some really contrasting visions. And if you go back earlier this year, actually, in the president's budget, we saw a tax plan that is designed to again begin to whittle down the size of the federal debt, that would raise taxes on the wealthiest Americans with a particular emphasis on taxing earnings from wealth to make that more similar to how we tax work in this country, a huge issue where working families pay taxes on almost all of their income at the full rate, whereas investors, people who make a lot of money through the stock market, other purposes, pay at a lower rate because of all of the different preferences we have for wealth in this country. The president also proposed to bump back up that corporate tax rate that, again, is sort of a thread that carried through to the House bill we were just talking a minute ago. And the president would also go back and restore the child tax credit that was made fully refundable, again, putting money back in the pockets of families with children during the pandemic. And what we saw during that expansion was a huge reduction in child poverty. We saw families actually beginning to save because they had a little bit of extra money in their pockets that they could maybe put in a child's college savings account. We saw just tremendous and now very well and rigorously documented benefits to families that had the stability provided by that child tax credit. So that's really at the core of the president's proposal. It's also been a major priority for Democrats in both the Senate and in the House. And if you look at the winners, and if you'll have it sort of the losers of the two proposals, again, they're almost mirror images. The president's proposal would reduce taxes for low middle income families, raise taxes at the high end of the income distribution. That proposal that just passed through the House would provide, in contrast, the provisions I just mentioned. 58% of the benefits of that tax cut would go to the top 1% for the Americans that benefit. And and I think this is an important piece to underscore, a full 1/3 of the benefits of that Republican proposal would go to foreign investors who own stock in U.S. companies.
Your story links to the work of Bobby Kogan. That's a colleague of yours at the Center for American Progress. He recently reported during the debt fight that debt would actually be decreasing permanently had it not been for Republican tax cuts during the Bush and Trump administration. So I'm going to ask you this question in two parts. First part is, what was the impact of the Trump tax cut plan on the economy and debt, number one? And then number two, does this Biden tax cut plan, does that kind of sort of work to reverse what the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act of 2017 did?
Let's first go to my colleague Bobby's work and what we know about the Trump tax cuts. Yes, we've had, going back, starting with President George W. Bush in the early aughts, and those tax cuts combined with the Trump tax cuts contribute about 57% of the debt ratio in the country. That's the sort of the trajectory of the debt going forward. They are the primary reason why we do have increasing federal debt. The Congressional Budget Office just looked at the impact of extending the Trump tax cuts and found that now through the next decade, about 2033, they would add $3.5 trillion to the deficit. And again, that's also part of a broader Republican economic proposal, would be to fully extend the temporary parts of that Trump tax cut. So yes, if we look at why do we have increasing debt, it's because of a series of measures that have cut the amount of money that comes into the federal government to pay for the services that we all need and that form the backbone of a healthy economy. Our transportation systems, investments in research, investments in our families. The Biden proposal, to get to your second question, would reverse that. It does make some important investments in families, primarily families with children, but on balance, it also raises a significant amount of new revenue. Some of that would go to stabilize Medicare and Social Security. We've heard, I think a lot of us have heard about, some of the problems decades out into the future. The Biden plan would make Social Security solvent through about 2050, if I have that figure correct. And it would bring in money to begin whittling down the federal deficit.
You have two plans here. The House Republican plan may get through the House, but then where does it go in the Senate? And then you obviously have a plan from the White House. Is there middle ground? Is there something that could help maybe the Republican proposal get through the Senate, or maybe get some bipartisan effort in the House if there was some provisions added to make Democrats happy? What do you think? Is there middle ground?
I mean, there certainly are, as I said a few moments ago, a number of members of Congress that are deeply committed to bringing back that child tax credit, making it refundable so the lowest income families get the full benefit. We now have a child tax credit on the books, but it's not fully refundable. So that is a big priority for many Democrats. I think it's also something that there is potentially Republican support for. Could we see negotiations that try to tie that to some of the business tax breaks, possibly. I think, again, there's always a desire for negotiation. That's always a possibility. We'll look at what happens over the next several months.
You got less than 30 seconds to answer this question. If you can help me out with it, what's the public saying about this? Any idea what the public sentiment is?
I think the public's eyes glaze over a lot when we talk about some of the subtleties of the tax breaks. I think there's tremendous support for helping to make life better for families with kids in this country. I think that is a deeply held American value and is something that there's strong support for. And I think that people want to see a tax code where the wealthy and large corporations pay their fair share.
Thanks to Gene Ross, Senior Fellow, Economic Policy, the Center for American Progress, for diving into the national tax landscape with us on today's Wheelhouse. Thank you, Gene.
Thank you so much, Frankie.
Today's show, produced by Tess Terrible and Meg Dalton. Our technical producer is Kat Pastor. Download the Wheelhouse anytime on your favorite podcast app. This is the Wheelhouse. I'm Frankie Graziano. Thank you for listening.